We're at the New York Historical Society, and I'm speaking to historian Linda Kerber. Professor Kerber teaches at the University of Iowa, or rather she's now retired from the University of Iowa. And she is, perhaps it's fair to say, one of the leading historians of women, especially in relationship to the law. Linda, let's start with the concept that we have already mentioned several times, but we've never really paused to examine it. The concept of coverture, which you've written so much about, and which I think we and most historians of women would agree is the thread that runs through the history of women from the colonial period down to our own day. Can you start with what coverture meant? Let's start at the revolutionary period as we move into the transition to the new republic.
The revolutionary generation was really revolutionary in many ways. And the revolution itself was radical in many ways. They pulled down the statues of King George, they melt them down to make bullets, they used the bullets to shoot at the redcoats. But they stabilized the revolution by keeping in place the system of slavery, which they had, and they stabilized the revolution by keeping in place the old law of domestic relations, which they had inherited from the British, and which they do not tinker with. They do not even need to describe. It is not described in the federal Constitution. And in that law, there is embedded the practices that we would call coverture. And it translates very easily as the wife is covered at marriage by her husband's civil identity.
So we've talked a little bit in earlier segments about Blackstone and exactly, the notion that he, if he doesn't introduce, he codifies it, of women as being not just covered by their husbands, but belonging to their husbands. Elaborate on that a little bit. What do we mean when we say a woman is the property of her husband?
She's not quite the property. At marriage, the husband gains absolute access to the body of his wife. There is no concept of rape in marriage until the 1970s. And that is, no concept of rape in marriage law until the 1970s, when feminists put it there. And if you look at the rape statutes before that, they all have the phrase, on the body of a woman, not his wife. So if the husband has this power over the woman's body, it seemed to them that it followed that he gains power over the property that she brings to the marriage and the property she earns during it. It seemed to them to follow that the husband would be the head of the family and choose where the family would live. This is the power of what we would call over the domicile. It seemed to them that the husband had a claim to his wife's services, by which they meant her work in the household, her work for taking in boarders, let us say, in which there is money to be made in the work of the household, and in her sexual availability. And that concept of services technically was called consortium. And the husband had a claim on it in his wife, but not until the 1950s. And only in two places in the 1950s, one of which was Iowa, and not fully until I think the 1990s, did a wife have a claim on her husband's consortium.
So what you're saying basically is that a married woman has no right at all to determine, to live separately from her husband, to determine her own religion, let's say, to
I don't think they really go there on religion. But what she doesn't have a right to do is make decisions on behalf of the children. She cannot decide where the child is apprenticed. She cannot decide where the child is educated. If they disagree, his decision must come. And she has no role in civil life, because it's assumed that since he has power over her body and power over her property, you wouldn't let a married woman vote, because he could blackmail her and to voting as he chose. So it would give a married man 2 votes. What is still a mystery, but is definitely true, is that for the most part, these infirmities of the married woman were assumed in the culture at large to stretch out to cover all women, married or not married. So a single woman still controlled her property, but that property did not give her the right to vote, even at a time and place where there were property requirements for voting.
It did briefly, though, in New Jersey, for example. So what happened there?
New Jersey wrote, it's delicious. New Jersey had many Quakers. They wrote their voting statutes in terms of persons. Single women with property met the voting requirements, and they voted until 1807, when people figured out that the women's vote may have changed and affected the outcome of an election, whereupon the legislature scurried and put it out of their power to vote.
And that was the end of that. By 1807,
That's
I
right.
gather women had lost the power.
That was the end
So
of that.
return to the children, because this I think many people find intriguing. You've been a pioneer of that concept of Republican womanhood or Republican motherhood, an idea which actually invests some power in women to educate their children. How do we reconcile Republican motherhood with coverture?
Think about these constraints of coverture. Anything a woman might say in that context is going to come up against male privilege. But in the era of the Revolution, one of the worries that patriots had was how they would transmit the meaning of the revolution to the next generation who would grow up in a new society. And they worry about where the civic virtue to sustain the revolution is going to come. And in that context, women raise their hands and say, well, we are the mothers. No one complains about that. We will raise our sons to be the next generation of virtuous citizens. We will raise our daughters to make choices about who they marry among men who are virtuous citizens. We have a role in sustaining the virtue of the new republic. And under that heading, which is very patriotic, men can accept that. And under that heading, they can claim an education. So they use that language to push for claims to better education than they had. One of the sweet things about this is you can see, I haven't done the numbers, but more and more portraits of women show them holding a book rather than associated with the cornucopia of fruits and flowers and multiplying and stuff like that. The historian Susan Klepp recently added something very forceful to this agenda of political thinking women in the early republic. She started watching birth rates. She noticed that in this era of the early republic, women are writing to each other when they get pregnant in misery, saying, oh dear, your time of pain and danger is coming. Isn't it sad that you have come up against this time of pain and danger so frequently? And she hears them talking about birth as problematic and not simply as a joy. And she started counting. And it turns out that the number of children who are in the families of the signers of the Declaration of Independence is a little over an average of 7 children per household.
7 living children.
7 living children. I'm not sure, but I think it is. And in Washington's cabinet and the signers of the Constitution, which is, about 15 years later, those people are going to have families of a bit less than 5. That is an enormous shift within barely a generation.
Right.
And what she concludes is that the women of the early republic, when they heard the language of independence and self-possession, which the men flung against the king, they took it into their own bedrooms. Their need was to control the intimacies to which they were subject. If the men talked about self-control in public, they wanted self-control in the bedroom. In the bedroom.
This is fascinating. So what you're really saying is that coverture exists as a system of law and a system of custom as well, but that there are holes in it, or sieve-like women find ways to exercise their own voices, to participate in this community, in civil life, even though technically they're excluded from it.
That's right. And they do it in the holes. There's a wonderful diary entry by a Connecticut young woman who embroidered patriotic emblems on something and says she did this work in her diary and felt nationally. And then there are the women of Philadelphia who go house to house, knocking on doors, raising money to support Washington's troops. And that takes guts, because the doors can be shut in their faces. They are going out in public. They can be scorned. They raise this money. They ask for money. They ask for silver, which can be melted down. And then they tell Washington that they've got some funds for him. He's at Valley Forge. And he says, wonderful, wonderful, give us the money. And they say, no, because you might put that money into the general stuff I've never seen. We want the men to know that they have gotten something from the ladies of Philadelphia. So they use the money to buy cloth, and they use the cloth to make shirts. When I first heard about this, I thought they were being cute little ladies sewing, but it wasn't about that. It was about making things that were useful for the men that came from the women of Philadelphia.
Wonderful.